All right. It is Thursday, June 9th, 2021, and this is the Fight Business Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Auger, and today we'll be talking about some business news regarding One Championship. You have a couple of board of directors leaving the promotion. You've got some fighters airing their grievances regarding how the promotion's been treating them. And you've got CEO Chatri Sityodtong going around trying to do some fundraising. We're going to break all of that down along what it means for the promotion moving forward. Then we're going to talk about the PFL. Obviously, you've got some issues this season with a couple of heavyweights, Fabricio Werdum and Muhammad Usman, withdrawing, and we've done a separate video on that, which I encourage you to go check out. But now you've also got Anthony Pettis withdrawing due to an illness last minute and being rebooked for the June 25th card. I'm going to break down the risks and issues that the PFL's business model has right now, ways they can mitigate it going forward, and what they can do for this season so they can kind of salvage it and get the best bang for their buck, so to speak. Then we're going to talk about pay-per-view buy predictions for UFC 263. You've got Israel Adesanya versus Marvin Vettori in a rematch that is headlining this card. You've also got a fight of the year rematch in the co-main event between Brandon Moreno and Davison Figueiredo. It's a big card with a lot of ramifications. Adesanya has been a draw. Will that keep up after his loss to Jan Blachowicz? We'll break that down. And, you've got Vettori on the B side. What does he bring? I'll break all of that down and give you my pay-per-view buy prediction. Lastly, we're going to talk about Vettori's new sponsorship deal with Dolce Gabbana. It is a big deal for a couple of reasons, and maybe not the reasons you think. I'm going to talk about why that sponsorship is important for not just Vettori, but the UFC and other fighters as a whole. So with that in mind, you've got timestamps at the bottom as always, and let's go ahead and dive right in. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about today is all of the business news cropping up around One Championship. So if you haven't heard the news already, reported by several outlets, I am reading from and looking at dealstreetasia.com. Christy Neo does a fantastic job over there. If you don't follow her on Twitter, I highly suggest it. She is really on top of the One Championship stuff. Just fantastic reporting. But you've got two board of directors stepping down from One's board, essentially. And they are Fa Hung, who is the manager directing at Temasek Holdings, and Derek Lau, the CEO of Heliconia Capital Management, which is also under Temasek, basically. Now, Temasek is a very interesting company, and I wanted to break this down in a bigger detail, and probably will at some point, but I just haven't had the time because it's a lot of scope. But this is a Singapore state-owned company, and it has deep ties to One Championship. Now, One is saying, and I quote, from Hua Feng Te, group president of Group One Holdings, which is One Championship, that's what they file under in Singapore, that, and I quote, as part of our plans for a public listing, we are taking a number of technical steps to ensure that we have the right governance structure in place for various jurisdictions, including the US. Temasek and Heliconia Capital remain fully engaged and supportive with our strategic direction. If you break that down in layman's terms, what they're saying is it doesn't look good for two of our board of directors to be involved with a Singapore-owned company. So we are having them resign, and we're going to replace them with a board, or a couple of board directors rather, that will be more appealing to US investors. That's really what this is. If you think about it, that's their response to this. Now, is this really the case? Is this why it's happening? I tend to lean yes. It's possible to cover, right? And that Temasek and One's relationship has soured, which would be a very big deal in itself. And these guys both resign and they're like, yep, we're done. It's possible. One has a lot of financial issues. It's been a minute since they've really, had a good financial fiscal year, which you can see on our website when I broke down what happened in 2019 with One Championship and what was likely to happen with 2020. But it's also very possible that this is all standard run of the mill type of procedure when you're looking to, list publicly through a SPAC, which is what One Championship is trying to do. And we have another episode on that you can go back and check out. There's a couple threads as well. But that all being said, either way, it's a big deal because Temasek is very involved in One Championship. And I will do a later expose on I've been building to for a while now. But they have very deep ties to the organization. And having both of those guys step down could very well change things. It might be more of a formality, again, where, yes, they're stepping down, but as the email response stated, they're fully engaged and supportive. So they might still be kind of not directly calling the shots, but influencing their replacements or other members of the board. But it's that perception of having them off of the board of directors may appeal to more U.S. investors if they don't think that they're getting involved with, the Singapore government. That is a thing I've seen before, where you've got some state-owned company or you've got state-owned, backers that are sitting on the boards of certain companies, and then it makes it look like One Championship is a Singapore state-owned company, which is not the case, and becomes a whole thing. But it's that perception is a big deal for a lot of reasons. So it is a shakeup. The actual depth of the ramifications of that is not known. If both of those men are no longer involved in One Championship, I think that has very big ramifications moving forward. If it is just them kind of stepping back and letting them pick a couple of different board members so that they appeal to more U.S. investors, I don't think it's going to change much at all. I do think time will tell what the case is, though, because if we start seeing some major structured changes at One, then that leads me to believe that it is them really backing off and kind of stepping away, even though, the press release or really not press release, the scripted answer from the group president of One says otherwise. That could signal a couple of things. And we will get into that in a minute here because there's a reason that could very well be true. But we don't know exactly what it means yet. So it shouldn't be a huge whoa, this is a mega deal yet. We've got to dig in a little bit deeper here. We've got to sit and wait, see if One does do some restructuring, if they do go through some changes, because that's going to really tell us the impact of this. Either way, the perception should entice some more investors in the US because now you've got less involvement, or at least perceived involvement, of the Singaporean government. And you've also got the opportunity to replace those members with, people that may spark the interest of US investors. So I'm thinking if you get somebody, I'm not saying Elon Musk is going to do it, but similar to how Endeavor got Elon Musk on their board, right? You get a bigger name that more US investors will recognize on your board, and that's going to help you sell when you list. So let's wait and see on that, see what that means. Before we go into the fundraising issues and what Chatri is up to, let's talk about some fighter issues, because that also gives us a hint of what's going on at One a little bit. And you've got Vitor Belfort essentially being released from One Championship. Now, remember, he retired from the UFC. He signed with One Championship, was calling for, a couple of opponents and was saying, I'm ready to go after some people. But then, as it turns out, he doesn't fight, and it's just kind of over. He's gone. He's not going to fight there. And according to Vitor, what his words were that his agenda and One's couldn't consolidate and his contract came to an end. So, that is interesting because that was a big signing for One Championship. A lot of people expected Vitor to go in there and, challenge for, at least a contendership to a belt. But there was a lot of opportunity for One. There was a lot of marketing around it. There was a lot of, hey, we got Vitor Belfort. It's a big deal. To let him go, and the way that he phrased it, I'm thinking it's more money than anything else. Part of the reason that I'm thinking it's money is you've got Bibiano Fernandez, who is also very upset with one after he's been quote unquote frozen, or they've according to him freezed him out for a couple of years, where he's been urging to fight and it just hasn't happened. Now, why would one sign Vitor and then not have him fight at least once, and B, take one of their most recognizable names, homegrown guys, Bibiano Fernandez, and not give him a fight for 2 years, right? I think, again, it's money. I think it's about contract structure. I think it's about fighter payout. If you look at who they've been having fight, you've got a couple of bigger names, especially for the US, right? You've had Mighty Mouse, you've had Eddie Alvarez, you've had, a couple of bigger name guys, Brandon Vera, right? Even though he lost the belt, Ong Lan Song. I mean, you've got some big names there, but those are guys that, you don't have to pay. But if you're, based on what we know regarding One Championship's push to come to the US and make a splash, those are the stars that are going to get the most attention stateside by far, right? Even Ong Lan Song is one of the bigger One Championship stars. And then you've got Eddie, you've got Mighty Mouse, and you've got Bular, who, was a UFC fighter against Brandon Vera, who, also former UFC fighter. Makes a lot of sense to, have those eyes stateside. I mean, in Bular's case too, you get Canadian eyes on it. You've got, Justin Trudeau coming out and saying, congratulating Bular on his victory. That's a bigger deal. So it makes sense they're pushing those guys. But then you look back on guys who maybe don't move the needle as much internally from the metrics they have, but are still stars within the promotion. And you've got a guy like Bibiano Fernandez, right? I could see that being the issue, especially since he's urging them. He's not injured. He doesn't have any, unless he's somehow really pissed off the organization in some way. But I don't know how that really would be the case. Even then, you still got one of your more notable guys who's begging for a fight. Like, imagine if Cowboy Cerrone in the UFC was just begging for a fight and they just wouldn't give it to him. You'd be questioning your head like, why? Well, the only reason that makes sense, especially with Vitor making a big deal about being there, ready to fight, and then leaving, is cash. They just don't want to waste any cash, or spend any cash, rather, that they don't view having potential for very high returns, or that meets their strategic short-term and long-term plan, which the short-term plan is clearly getting to the US, right? And Miesha Tate, who came back to the UFC, said that was a big part of what she was supposed to do before COVID hit. That's something that Chatri had mentioned multiple times before COVID hit. And this has definitely been their push with March Madness and, March Madness commercials. And then, being on TNT, this has been a big push for One Championship to come to the US and finally take that step. That is their short-term strategic goal. So it's interesting, because if you don't have enough money to pay those guys, generally that means you're a little bit hard up for cash. It's one thing if you're either cutting those guys because they're, winning and losing, but they're not really star power-esque, or you're not paying guys that maybe are somewhat recognizable, but aren't really going out there often, or haven't built up the name for themselves yet. And you're not having them fight because you're trying to save money. This is a scenario where that signals to me that you are more hurt financially if you can't get somebody like Vitor Belfort that you specifically signed to come make an impact and draw, UFC casual fan eyes to your product, or Bibiano, who is a fantastic fighter and one of those homegrown stars, at one championship, but maybe not a Christian Lee or an Angela Lee or someone, alongside who they really think they can market and push the right way. So that's concerning to me. And that brings us to what Chatri has been up to. Because in that same DealStreetAsia.com article, they learned that one championship is to be the quote here is to be in dire need of funds. Deal Street Asia understands that its chairman and CEO, Chatri Setyodong, has made trips to the Middle East in recent months to raise from private investors. And that estimates earlier this year showed that one championship will need to make some drastic cuts to stem its cash burn or risk eating too far into its dwindling funds. So something that I covered, this is something that Chrissy covered, Nash covered as well, with the financial filing for 2019 that one championship got to essentially extend because of the pandemic, but they had to file their financials for 2019, and they were bad. They were not good at all. I mean, their costs were out of control. And yes, their revenue is going up, but their net losses are just, ridiculous. In 2019 alone, nearly 100 million. I mean, that's bad news. 100 million US in Singapore, and I think it's 131, something like that. But they have been struggling. And as I've mentioned on this show multiple times, they are a startup. That is what they are. They're going out, they are reaching out to investors, they are preaching the gospel of, yes, we are changing the game, we are disrupting everything, we are doing what we have to do in order to bring honor to martial arts and all this grand vision. It's startup speak all over. You can tell a mile away if you've ever worked startup versus working at, more of an established, mature company. It is startup speak 101 is what Chatri's been doing on interviews and what he's been trying to do with, his press releases and signings and all of that. And the problem with startups is that they do not make money on their own for a long time and usually require heavy investment, which we've also talked about on the show multiple times. That is part of the reason why Temasek may actually be upset and why those guys, this might be a cover about those guys resigning in order to get the right governance board for the US might be a cover, because it might be that Temasek is done. And if that's the case, that's very bad news, because that's a huge investor in one. But the fact that Chatri is also going to the Middle East and looking for private investors and going out to that tells me that the pitch that he's been doing for several firms, Sequoia, who else we got involved here? Let's see. TPG Capital, right? Our GIC limit. So I could keep listing out acronyms, but most of you either won't know them or you can look it up. But either way, when you're looking at those investment groups, there's a reason why Chatri's not going back to them, why he's having to go to the Middle East to find private investors. Because ultimately, my guess is that well has been tapped dry. So if Temasek is very upset, that might be why you have those two guys stepping down from the board, which would be a very bad sign. Maybe they're doing it to, again, help out one as it hits the US market. But Chatri is going around and clearly trying to do fundraising in order to stem the cash burn. And we've talked about their cash burn on this. And when you take into account everything we've talked about the past several months regarding one championship, and then these three events, it certainly looks very bad for one championship. If you do not believe in coincidences, which I tend to in the financial world, especially the business world, you've got two fighters who said that they couldn't come to agreement on fighting in their own different ways, right? That did not get paid by one to fight in the past couple of years, probably and almost certainly held bigger salaries, but weren't necessary for the strategic move and marketing into the US. You've got two board of directors who are part of Temasek Holdings, which is one of the biggest investors and has the deepest ties to one championship, stepping down from the board. Again, we've talked exhaustively about why one has said this is happening, but just looking at the facts, that's happening. And then you've got Chaudhry running around in the Middle East trying to get fundraising. This certainly appears to be a red flag in terms of where one championship's financials are. And don't forget, they just did the One Apprentice show as well, right? And this is often how it happens with startups. I've worked at many startups where cash burn was insane, but revenue kept coming in through fundraising and through other means, and everything's going great. And in the matter of 12 months to 2 years, all of a sudden, it's like that. It can crater out. The walls just hit. You've got several months of like, yeah, we're burning cash, but it's all right. We're going to get more revenue. We're going to go do some more seed rounds. We're going to figure this out. And then that doesn't hit. And all of a sudden it's crunch time and you're in trouble and you're cutting costs like nobody's business. This is pretty bad because we've already seen one championship have to lay off several of their staff and, basically do a whole bunch of other things to cut costs because they haven't been profitable and because investors have been upset. Very well could be that investors are done pumping money into this. That Temasek is saying, you know what? We invested in this. It's not becoming profitable. We need to pull the plug. You've had your shot in the US. You didn't get the numbers we needed on the US rating system, right? Because the US television rating systems showed pretty clearly that they weren't pulling in huge numbers that they tout, from their own shows. And all this other stuff's going on that kind of says right now, anyway, the US expansion was not a huge success. And so the investors might have been holding out for that. And now that's done. And they're saying, okay, we're out of here. Sunk cost, right? No use in trying to put money into this to pull it back out because it's sunk cost. We just got to write it off. Very, very possible at this stage. If that's the case, one championship could be headed for bankruptcy. And now it's something I've talked about before. I have a video on it if you want to go back and watch the 10-minute quick video I did when we released one's financials for 2019. But 2020 obviously wasn't a good year for the promotion. And 2021 may not be good in the way it needs to be to get that additional investor funding. If Chaudhry can't find further outside investment, and he will need further outside investment, they're not going to be profitable this year. You look at the trend of their financials, it would take a mega deal. It would take the SPAC that they are listing as to raise an insane amount of money in order to get them to a profitable point. Is it possible? Sure. But it's very, very unlikely. So you still need that investment and new investment money coming in. And it sounds like Chaudhry's having a hard time getting that next round. And if he doesn't close it, if he can't find someone willing to put the money in, there's simply no way that one can keep going. And one will be done. It will have to shutter. Are we at that stage? I think we are preliminary stages of one shutting down right now. Unless some big news comes through, unless a deal gets done, I think one championship is in deep trouble and closes within 12 months. Now, again, Chaudhry has been able to raise funds before. He clearly is a great salesman in that regard in terms of pitching the vision of one championship and what he's trying to do. I think he can find more investment, but will that happen? I don't know. And this certainly isn't a good sign because also if I'm looking to invest and I see now that Temasek has, at least from the naked eye, resigned their board of director seats, and I'm definitely calling them if I can, right? Definitely saying like, hey, what's up? If I have that power, I'm definitely talking to other investors of ONE right now, especially Temasek after the board resignation. Get it straight from the horse's mouth. Did you guys actually resign, or is it, just for this U.S. appeal? Which one is it? I would be doing my due diligence and watching like a hawk, because we already know the numbers are not great. So, I don't know. It may be the end of ONE championship. We'll see. We will see, but I would not be shocked if they end up shuttering in the next 12 months. We'll keep an eye on it. That's what's going on. But yeah, big deal, because if that shuts down, then you got to wonder what happens to their fighters. You got to wonder, if somebody tries and fills the void, because they were making moves, and, startups do amazing things and they're going great until they don't anymore. And that's how startups work. Remember, PFL is also a startup, which we'll get into here in a second, but this is how fast it can end. Things behind the scenes, if you don't get that investor money when you're a startup, it's done. Done deal. So we'll keep an eye on it. I'll keep you informed of anything I learn. I will hopefully get that expose on Temasek's ties to ONE out here in the next 6 months, but I'm giving you 6 months because it still has a lot of work to do, and obviously I got a lot going on. So that's what's going on with ONE championship. All right, next up, I want to talk about another startup in the MMA world, or what I consider to be a startup in the MMA world, the Professional Fighters League, PFL. So obviously this season has been a little rough for them, right? You had fighters at the beginning of the year threaten to file a lawsuit because they couldn't go fight other places while the bubble was being set up and all of that. You have multiple fighters pulling out for various reasons. You had a couple in the heavyweight division miss weight and end up with negative numbers. And then you had Werdum and Muhammad Usman pull out, and you've got Verdum's controversy, right, with Renan Ferreira, where had he, been awarded a submission, he would have enough points that he might actually make the playoffs. But now he's got 1 point. He's not fighting again. He's almost certainly out. It's quite the conundrum for them. You got Anthony Pettis pulling out last minute due to illness and having to reschedule him and switch up the matchups. We've had a lot of switched matchups where you go back and look at the original PFL matchups that were announced, both the first group and now the second group here slated to start tonight. It's a thing, right? It's definitely a thing, the amount that they've switched. So this is unfortunately the inherent risk with this particular format and business model. Now, don't get me wrong. I love the tournament style. This to me is, as a merit-based fan, where I want to see, even if it's matchups where it's like, man, this kind of sucks. I want to see the guy who's in line based on merit get the title shot, get the opportunities, all of that. I love the PFL's concept. I really do. And I was very excited for this season with all of the signings from, Rory McDonald to Anthony Pettis to Fabricio that started to liven it up a bit. Because I was watching, before when you had, biggest name in the heavyweights might have been Jared Rosholt, or the most recognizable one rather. And, I loved it. But with this particular season, you a lot of good names, a lot of good guys. This was said to be the biggest season yet, and it's just been semi a disaster. Not entirely, but lots of issues have gone on. And this is the risk with this model, is that if a fighter gets injured or a fighter misses weight or a fighter runs into whatever have you, I mean, that's kind of it. You have to swap them. You have to find an alternate. You have to kind of run with it. And they've done a good job of filling the fights, but it takes away some of the merit as well, right? Because now you've got guys who come in as alternates, basically have one shot to get a first round, second round finish, and hopefully get into the playoffs, while other guys that have pulled out are just out pretty much. And if you won your first fight, right, now you're fighting your second fight and you did very well, right? If you're Brendan Loughlin, any of that, like if you're in that scenario, you can not necessarily sit back, but you can definitely kind of just, take your time and you're almost guaranteed in. Not 100%, but it's going to be hard to get knocked out of that, right? Play it safe in your next fight. Why not? So it's tough. It's a tough scenario for the promotion. But when you have these risks, which we've seen through other seasons where a fighter gets injured, right, in the 2 fights in one night, that was their big thing. We're doing 2 fights in one night, and you get fighters getting injured and not being able to compete in the next round, and you have alternates step in. At least then you had, ideally, if somebody lost, they would have the opportunity to come back and step in if somebody got hurt, or you had somebody that you knew you could bring in because of whatever. But this is something the promotion has known about for some time, that fighters get injured, especially in a tournament format. It happens in almost every tournament, and they're unable to continue on as they should. And you've got to have backups prepared. You've got to have alternates. You've got to have alternates. You've got to have some sort of structure going on, right, as to why someone should get an opportunity. PFL just hasn't really done that. They do have a system, but it's not working for them, right? Last minute pull out, having to switch matchups has huge ramifications when you only have 2 fights to get in to the playoffs. And you've got, alternates stepping in scenarios or scenarios like Werdum and Ferreira, where that was a whole big mess, and you don't really run it back in a rematch or anything. I mean, you can't anyway because Verdum's out. But before Werdum had withdrawn, you say, no, we're going to keep it at, 1 point apiece because it was technically a no contest and all this. And that has huge ramifications on both those guys because you only get 2 fights to prove that you're in. That's not a great format. Yeah, I mean, there's too much risk there, in my opinion, that you could have a scenario like this where people have to pull out. You don't have a long enough length of time that they can come back from an injury or something happens, or have other opportunities to get into the playoffs because they have to miss fights for various reasons. It's too narrow a window, 2 fights in this particular model, in my opinion. So what could the PFL do moving forward for this season, and what can they do for future ones, right? Because this can't keep happening. It's not a sustainable model. When you're a startup, you need people to love your stuff. You need to build momentum. This is just chopping momentum down left and right. It's not good. You had all those big signings. You had more eyeballs hypothetically on you than ever before, or at least had the perception of that. And now it's just been chaos all around. Well, here's what you do for the rest of the season, right? You spin it as anybody has a shot. That's what you got to do. You got to take this and you have to spin it around and market it correctly. Marketing is going to be key here. And PFL has a solid marketing team. I'm sure they can do it. But you've got to position yourself as, yes, a lot of people pulled out for various reasons and there was all of this, but look at the new guys that have stepped in. These were guys that weren't even in the tournament, but they signed with us. And now they're an alternate, and now they have a shot at $1 million. And that's how you market this. You market it to the fighters, not the fans. Yes, you still market it to the fans in the narrative, of course. And you say, you follow some of these guys and say, man, yeah, I never even thought I'd have an opportunity $1 million. I wasn't even in the tournament. Here I am. Somebody pulled out. This is my shot. You position it in that way. People love that. People love the underdog story, and that's what you've got is a bunch of underdogs now stepping in because the recognizable names and season favorites had to pull out for various reasons. And you push that, right? Lord knows why they didn't have Clay Collard, who beat Anthony Pettis in a massive upset, be on the main card of his scheduled second bout. Lord knows why they didn't do that. Because that is an underdog story, and you sell that. And to the fighters, you sell it as, man, yeah, anything can happen here. It's crazy. Come sign with us. You don't think you have a real opportunity at $1 million? You totally do. Look at this guy who had his shot at the playoffs, who had his shot even after losing. He gets to step in. You never know what's going to happen in the tournament format. You position it as that, as it's exciting. You have no idea who knows what's going to happen in the tournament format, right? Like anything can happen. Yeah, you got your favorites, but look, they had to pull out. This is crazy. You've got to sell the underdog story if you're PFL here. And you've got to sell it to the fighters too, so that when you're looking to sign more name value fighters, you can point to that and be like, look, we're looking for the best. And yeah, these guys, Anthony Pettis found out, we've got some tough guys here, but anybody can make it, right? You can sell that story and that pitch to name value guys, to brand new guys, to whoever you want, and say, look at this. You can spin that in so many different ways. That's what you've got to focus on right now for the rest of the season. You've got to drop the focus on, yes, these are our big stars, right? Like, yeah, do your Kayla Harrison promo, of course. Focus on Pettis a little bit, but focus on the underdogs, because that's what made PFL so exciting to watch in the first place. Right? It was a tournament and you never know who's going to win. And you had a couple of name guys in there, but Sean O'Connell going from, a good career in the UFC, but not one that's going to be a UFC championship around his waist, to winning $1 million. I mean, that's the story you sell. You sell all of these different things. I mean, you probably leave out the fact that he didn't do as well in the UFC. Of course, you're not trying to do that, but you get what I'm saying, is that you market it as an underdog story and that anything can happen in a tournament. You market it like an upset of a 15 seed and a number 2 seed in the final 4. That's how you promote this. And that's how PFL will have to shift this if they want to salvage the rest of their season. Because without that, I'm not sure what the next best strategy is. That to me is the best marketing strategy and the best thing you can do here. Moving forward to future seasons, what PFL needs to do, desperately needs to do, is set up a much more structured scenario and outline of what happens when fighters can't make it for various reasons, right? And have several alternates ready and focus on those alternates as well as everyone else. Maybe have a fight to get into the tournament, right? To even get into the regular season, just stage a bunch of bouts where contender series style, right? You just have these guys, they fight, and then if you win, you're in the season. And you can easily sell that. You extend the season a little bit because you have these fight to get in things. And then you got notable names and people who have already fought, so that if you have people dropping out, all of a sudden you're able to pick people to come back. And it's got to be more structured. You've got to have more clarity for the average viewer as to how people are selected, how matches are made if people have to drop out. Because it's confusing to most of us hardcores, right, on the way that this is all done with all the various switches and, the placement of certain fighters and fights and all of that. To the casual fans that are turning in just for Anthony Pettis or just for Fabricio, those guys that are just kind of following some of their bigger fighters, or the hardcore guys who are saying, you know what, I'll turn on mostly a UFC, maybe a Bellator guy, but I'll turn off PFL because I want to see, Pettis fight or Roy McDonald fight. Sure. Even we're confused. Those guys are the hardcores are super confused. Those guys are very confused. They're very, very confused. I'm obviously more of a hardcore because I'm doing this show and doing all of that, but you know what I'm saying. Been a long day. But yeah, it's a scenario where you've got to structure that out for next season and moving forward. You've got to make that crystal clear, and you can make it exciting and you can make it great. You've just got to find a way to do that and have it prepared, because otherwise you end up in a scenario like this where it just looks bad. With all the switching, with all the controversy, it doesn't look great. Perception isn't fantastic here. It looks like, as you can go on, RMMA or on Twitter or various other forums, You can go and read about how the tournament's falling apart or it's a disaster and it's all this stuff, because that's the way it looks. It looks like you had one plan and now it's not going according to that plan and it's a mess. The way you mitigate that is you make the plan elaborate enough that it literally can't go wrong, because you put in devices and you put in processes that allow you to control the narrative. You have lost control of the narrative right now, and that's the worst when it comes to promoting sports entertainment. At least I would imagine it's the worst. So that's really what needs to be done from a process standpoint moving forward, is PFL needs to map out and have contingency plans for this type of thing. And for the rest of the season, again, spin it all day long. Focus on the underdogs. You could sell that. I'm still excited to see where the tournament goes, but marketing should be much more on, the craziness of the situation, acknowledge it, and then focus on the underdogs. That'll get me more hyped. I'm sure it will get several others, especially some of the semi-casual guys who are looking and saying, wait, where's Werdum or where's Pettis? It'll get them more involved. That's how you win people over, especially in this type of scenario. So that's what PFL needs to do for this season and seasons going forward. Next thing we're going to dive into here is the UFC 263 pay-per-view buy predictions. So this will be the first pay-per-view that Israel Adesanya headlines since his loss to Jan Blachowicz. And there's a lot of questions and concerns about, is this going to hurt his star power? What's going on? Plus, you've got on the other side, and we don't really know what his drawing power is, right? And in the co-main, you do have a, amazing fight, which we saw last year, which was incredible. Fought to a draw between Deiveson Figueiredo and Brandon Moreno for the flyweight championship. And we get to see that rematch, which is great. But in terms of drawing power, again, we don't know exactly what that's going to do to affect all of this. We know main event is the biggest correlation to pay-per-view buys. Co-main does have some pull, and this will certainly help as a co-main. But it's going to be one of those things where the main question, again, centers around Adesanya. Adesanya is the second biggest star, in my opinion, in the UFC from a pay-per-view buys perspective, next to only McGregor. And yes, you could count Lesnar and Rousey, but they, if they ever come back, but I truly think at this point he has surpassed Jon Jones. If you look at some of Jones's known pay-per-view buys from his last couple fights that we have, right? They're good. They're classic Jon Jones, but they're not pulling what Adesanya is. At least from the numbers that we have for Adesanya. Again, all of these numbers you got to take with some grain of salt, but I would say there's enough sources and enough indication out there that Adesanya has surpassed Jones in terms of pay-per-view buys. That would be my opinion. With that being said, Adesanya had never lost in MMA up until now. And he lost in a fashion that I would say is better than getting, knocked out brutally, right? Or something like that. But still not as good as it could have gone. If Adesanya had, it'd been dead close and put up just a crazy war or a fight of the year contender and he lost, that keeps your stock where it is or buoys it a little bit, because he was going up. He was moving up to 205 to challenge. And that's an easy way to spin all of that. To lose to Jan the way he did, pretty not badly. That's not the word I want to use, because he fought very well. But it was a clear-cut decision for Jan, in my opinion, and most other people's opinions, that Jan clearly took that fight. And especially with Jan grappling him, right? I mean, those 2 rounds where Jan was just kind of on top of him, it turns off a lot of the more casual viewers. You know this. I know as a more hardcore fan, if you're more of a hardcore fan that's watching this, you have buddies who say, man, they're just kind of hugging each other, right? That whole freaking narrative. There are people that don't understand jiu-jitsu and don't understand grappling that see that and they're like, man, this isn't really a fight. This is just them hugging each other. He's just hugging him so he doesn't do that. You know how it goes. I'm sure you know how it goes. If you are a casual fan who happened to stumble on this show, please like and subscribe to the channel, and I hope you become more of a hardcore one. But I'm sure you know that you don't necessarily generally by grappling, right? That's just how it is a lot of the times. Maybe you are a rarity. Maybe you know of rarities. I know of one or two. But in general, that type of fight doesn't seem to excite the casual viewer. They want knockouts. They want crazy submissions. They want scrambles. They want action. And that wasn't a ton of action. So how does this affect Adesanya's drawing power going forward? Well, the fact that he was moving up to 205 helps a lot, right? And I think it's actually kind of smart here, even though I believe Whitaker should have gotten the next shot and they should have waited for him to recover. It's actually kind of smart here to put Adesanya up against Vettori because Vettori has made some leap and bounds in grappling and is viewed as a real grappling threat to Adesanya. And you know he's going to actually grapple. He's not going to be a Romero who tries 3 times and then that's it, right? Vittori's game plan almost certainly hinges on a lot of grappling. So the UFC can position this as, okay, well, we just saw Adesanya move up and get out grappled here. What happens when, he's back to 185? You got a real dangerous grappling guy, but a guy we know can strike too from his fight with Jack Hermanson, or at least that's how they'll sell it. It's a good way to position this because it'll be viewed as a test for Adesanya. It won't be Adesanya going in there and just styling on him. Ha, pun. It will be positioned as, well, maybe Vettori can win this and take the crown. That's a good way to promote a fight. And that's mostly what they've been doing, right? That's how they've positioned this. It makes a lot of sense. You just had Vettori fight and just grapple him to death. And now you've had Adesanya lose a decision with a lot of grappling not going his way. This is a good way to put them together and put that doubt in a lot of people's mind. Well, maybe Adesanya can't outstrike him. I leaned picking Vettori here, but this is, by far one of Adesanya's biggest tests. And that's a good business move on the UFC's part to sell it that way. That will entice a lot of casual fans to tune back in as well, right? To be like, well, we just saw him lose to that other guy because of grappling. Well, this guy's a heavy grappler. Well, he's going to lose, right? I think. Who knows? Can he bounce back? And imagine Adesanya goes out there and just like flash KOs Vettori, right? That's an easy thing for the UFC to sell in terms of, oh yeah, no, it's because he moved up in weight. Dana White has even said, oh, he needs time to get to 205. It's so easy to position all of this that way if Vettori loses on Saturday. So I think that will keep the number up to around what it is. The only issue is Vettori is not, again, a knockout artist or a big finisher a lot of the time. He's a decision guy. He has exciting fights. I enjoy watching him, but again, to the casual viewer, it might turn him off a little bit. There will be a certain subset of people who turned in for Adesanya Blachowicz who will be turned off that Adesanya is now fighting a heavy grappling guy, right? It's going to happen. They want to see crazy striking and knockouts. They want to see another Whitaker versus Adesanya or Costa versus Adesanya. Even though Adesanya flashed both of them, they want to see that stand-up battle. They want to see that, crazy style bender striking that you got with Gastelum Adesanya, right? That's what they want. That's what they desperately want. So those guys will be turned off from this. So I'm going to say, based on if we're taking the number of around 850K, which I believe was domestic, although I'd have to go back and check. But for Adesanya versus, that was actually costed. So Adesanya versus Blachowicz was, let's see here, generated according to, this is according to Bloody Elbow, which I'm assuming is using Sports Business Journal as their actual source. Yep. Is that around 800,000 buys globally, 600,000 buys on ESPN Plus, and then 200,000 buys outside the US. So that was with Adesanya going up to 205 and trying to become a dual champion, right? And that's probably more because of Blachowicz not being a huge draw, and they want to see John Jones or something else. So with that in mind, Adesanya coming back and fighting this, and yes, you will get a little bit of a bump from the co-main event. I'm going to say globally, I'm going to say, based on those numbers, I'm going to go 750K. I think you're going to get a slight dip because, again, there will be people turned off from Adesanya losing and then fighting a grappler right away. And just there will be people turned off from Adesanya losing in general because you've got those fair weather fans that are, only want to stick with you when you're winning. But Adesanya is enough of a star that I don't think you're going to get a bunch of those people. I don't think you're going to get thousands and thousands. I think really that 50K dip comes from Vettori not being as much of a draw. Not being, a dude that goes out there and gets crazy finishes or, has goes out and just submits everybody and has just nonstop finish city. Vettori's not that guy. He's the decision guy. And I think that is going to be more of the dip than anything else. I don't think it's going to be that much Adesanya has lost and now people are jumping off the wagon. I don't think that's the case. So I'll say 750K because, again, you've got a solid co-main event that should boost it a little bit. You got Adesanya losing last time and now facing a grapple that'll keep a lot of people intrigued, but also lose a little bit. And then you got Vettori, who, again, I have seen no indications that he's a real big draw. His style of fighting, what he does, is fantastic, and I think he's a real threat to Adesanya. But it's not drawing in a lot of eyeballs. It's similar to what Usman was like, right? Notice that Usman has started to get traction, yes, after he beat Masvidal again and all of that. But Usman went from being a decision type of guy to finishing people a lot, and that's really helped him. Usman didn't get a massive bump from Masvidal after he beat Masvidal the first time, which was a lot of wrestling, a lot of grappling, a 50-45, type thing across the board. He's getting more traction now and more attention after finishing Gilbert Burns and finishing Masvidal in the way he did, and that type of thing. That's really the catalyst. But the finishing aspect is very, very important, and Vettori just doesn't have that as much. So I'm going to go 750K global. I think that's a solid guess. It could be as much as 800K or 850K, but especially with the world opening up now more too because of vaccines going out and all of that. And, in the US, things are mostly back to normal. Travel is high summer, right? First summer since post-COVID, where things have been, pretty much back to normal in a lot of states. You best believe not a lot of people are tuning in to UFC pay-per-views unless they really are invested. And so for that reason, I think you're going to get a slight dip. And again, yeah, I just foresee it as being a slight dip. Could be even lower than that. Actually, now that COVID comes into play, I could see it going as low as 700 or 650 even. But I'm going to go 750 here. We'll see what happens. Let me know what your prediction is for UFC 263, what you think the pay-per-view buys will be. Do you think Adesanya loses a little bit star power because of everything that's happened and because of his opponent? Do you think that it's still strong as ever and to be at least 800K globally, if not more? Let me know because I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But I think there's enough factors here. It'll be a dip. I'm going just a very slight dip, but I could see it more than that. That's my prediction for UFC 263. All right, last thing I want to touch on here is Marvin Vettori getting a sponsorship with Dolce & Gabbana. It's a big deal. It's a luxury brand, a well-known luxury brand, right? And Vettori, again, is not necessarily the biggest star when it comes to MMA. Now, he is Italian, and if he wins, he will be the first Italian champion, I believe, which is a big deal. And so I'm thinking that it's more of a, nationalistic thing here that Dolce & Gabbana has decided to partner with Vettori. But more importantly than all of that is when you look at some of the sponsorships that have now gotten out there for fighters, I would say Vettori getting sponsored by Dolce & Gabbana. I believe you had Masvidal by Versace. You've had Adesanya by Puma, but you've also had some of the lower fighters getting some sponsorships too. I think Vettori's sponsorship is big in the sense of it signals the rise in popularity of MMA, specifically the UFC and the mainstream over the past year and a half. Remember, UFC was the first thing back. Everything kind of shut down. Sports were kind of canceled at the time, right? March Madness tournament got canceled. People were very upset. It was a whole thing. And UFC was the first to come back with fights. And we've talked about the COVID bump on the show where, yes, they got a bump because they were the first back, because they were one of the only regular sports going on. So people were kind of drawn to it. But that has had lingering effects. I truly feel that that's the case. As the pandemic has kind of wound down in certain parts of the world, or at least become more manageable, where you've got enough people vaccinated and things are, maybe not full capacity everywhere, but at least partial capacity now. You don't have the lockdowns as much. You don't have all of that, especially on the US side, which is the biggest consumer of, fight sports and UFC. You still see higher numbers than you would normally see, I would say, pre-pandemic. I really feel like you've got higher pay-per-view buys in general. You've got you've got just more talk around it, more lights, more media attention from the mainstream media perspective. And I feel like this type of sponsorship signals that as well. Because yes, Dolce & Gabbana, obviously you want to support an Italian fighter, but the fact that Vettori's even on the radar of a luxury brand like that, where they're going to say, man, like, oh, UFC, Italian UFC fighters fighting for the belt, the middleweight belt. Yeah, let's go ahead and sponsor him. That Dolce & Gabbana crunched the numbers, I'm sure, and didn't just do it out of charity or out of like, oh yeah, this is cool. They really probably crunched the numbers on this and thought like, yes, we are going to do this to support a guy, but we're also going to get more eyes on our product. And they are a high-end luxury product. Not, I don't want to say that all MMA fans are not in that class, but, Dolce & Gabbana is not going to buy a spot, I wouldn't think, at UFC, a random UFC pay-per-view, right? That's not really the target market that they're trying to go after generally. But the fact that they even got on the radar, that speaks volumes, right? Adesanya getting the Puma deal. I mean, these all speak volumes in terms of where the sport has grown. Because you would see this before, right? I mean, John Jones famously had Nike, which was by far the biggest. But it kind of died down, right? You had that early 2010s popularity spike where, man, I remember going to bars. I remember being in college and, you had so many guys wearing tap out shirt. You go to Buffalo Wild Wings on a Saturday of a almost any pay-per-view, but especially a big pay-per-view. And I was like, man, you better go at 1 p.m. to get a table, because people would sit there for hours before the show even started just to sit for the prelims. And you had to, because it was packed. It was packed, so packed. That was kind of the heyday popularity days. It's dropped since then, right? You get into 2014, 2015, 2016, like it kind of dropped a little bit, got a little bit more hardcore based. And the pandemic, I really think, has brought more eyes back to it. I think you're now seeing a second wave of popularity in MMA. And I think this is kind of a signal of that. That's my opinion on this, is that this signals to other fighters that, hey, yes, we are a little bit more mainstream. We're getting the attention of big, huge luxury brands. That's massive. that Dolce & Gabbana is sponsoring Vettori for this. It's a very, very big deal. And again, yes, it's tied to the nationality of it all and Vettori being Italian, but the fact that the UFC is even on that radar shows a heightened growth of popularity, in my opinion. So I would not be shocked if you see more sponsorships as time goes on for, title contenders, especially, you've got Cyril Gahn. I think that's the obvious one where if he is able to work his way up into a, title fight, that'll be a big deal. But even as I mentioned earlier on the show, you've got Justin Trudeau reaching out to Boulard and saying, congratulations. That really speaks a lot. You've got a lot more celebrity tweets and appearances and everything going around UFC from the pandemic that have stayed. That as other sports have come back, you still have a lot of celebrities talking about fights and talking about how they watch fights. It certainly seems like we're into a second popular wave of the sport. Will it last? Will it reach that next level? Who knows? But I think this signals that. And I think it's very important for fighters, especially when you're at that critical junction of Jake Paul, Tyron Woodley fights and Logan Paul versus Mayweather fights, where you talk about fighter pay and benefits and all that, because as the sport gets more popular and as more eyes are on it, UFC is going to make more money and fighters are going to be scratching their heads being like, Francis Ngannou, what are we doing wrong? Well, so many things, Francis. But you've got to wonder at this point, with a new popular wave looking on the sport, what happens here. So that's my thought, is that we are in a new popular wave. I don't know if it's a wave or if it's a new plateau, but I would say popularity has risen. And this helps signal that. That's my opinion. All right, guys. Well, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you're listening via Anchor, Spotify, Podcast Addict, anything like that, I appreciate you guys as always. If you're watching via YouTube, I love you guys. Make sure you hit the like button, subscribe button, bell notification, leave your comments. Let me know via Twitter, via the comments here, your thoughts on UFC 263 pay-per-view buys. What do you think is going to happen to One Championship? Do you think they're going to survive? Do you have any other questions you want me to dive into surrounding that? PFL, what's your thoughts on the PFL this season? Do you care? Do you not care? How do you feel about the whole situation and all of that as well? Let me know your thoughts and feelings of that. I love you guys watching as always. And until next time, get money.